it aims to the seasonality question, irrigation, access to markets, transportation, storage. So it's a sector with huge opportunities, but it also has its challenges. Now, many of us have a natural attraction to agriculture. Many of my friends and colleagues, when I speak to them in terms of what would you like to do, they say, I'm getting into farming. I'm getting into agriculture. And indeed, many of us are drawn to this sector because of government support for the sector, because it's quite clear that the potential demand is huge. In some instances, the barriers to entry appear low, and we know one or two people who've gotten into the sector and appear to be making money. But the one thing I would share with you for free is that if you are looking at this sector as a sector where you can become an overnight millionaire, then it's the wrong sector. That breakout session that teaches how to become overnight millionaires is holding at the EFCC office. Not So a lot of people have rushed into agriculture and gotten their fingers burnt, and then they've rushed out again. But, that will not be our portion here. We're here to gain knowledge about this sector because, as Pastor had said earlier, knowledge is power. And this morning, or this afternoon, we have a very knowledgeable speaker who will be sharing his perspectives with us. We're privileged to have with us Mr. Kola Masha. Mr. Kola Masha is the chief executive of an entity called Babangona. Now, Babangona is a remarkable entity because it's focused on attracting youth into agriculture. And a lot of the work they've done has been to attract youth, particularly in the north, into agriculture, to take them away from being available for extremist groups. But it's an entity that has had a very strong impact in the agricultural space. Today in Nigeria, that entity is the largest producer of maize in Nigeria, period. And their ambition is to become the largest producer in Africa. The other thing that's unique about this entity is that they have succeeded in doubling and in some instances tripling the average income of smallholder farmers in Nigeria. So if you think about that in terms of what that means, in terms of the potential multiplier effects. So it's an organization that has worked with smallholder farmers to double and in some instances triple their average incomes. Kola Masha, has extensive experience in agriculture. He's worked prior to focusing on Babangona. He had worked in the Notore Group, also focused on the agricultural space. He's worked in the venture capital space where he's been involved in raising finance for agriculture, and he also has an MBA from Harvard and a master's from MIT. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker for today, Mr. Kola Masha.
Good afternoon, everyone. So today's discussion is going to be broken up into two parts. The first is I thought I would share a little bit about my journey and why I decided to focus on agriculture and why I think all of you should. And then we'll focus in on discussing about specific opportunities in key value chains in agriculture, and round up with a Q&A session. So to begin, my friends, we have a problem in Nigeria. And that problem is rising insecurity. Researchers at the University of Sussex have been studying global insecurity around the world since the mid-90s. Their research clearly shows that from 2007 to 2017, the rate of increase in insecurity on the African continent grew 7-fold. Let's think about that. 7 times increase in a 10-year period of time. Why is this? Well, we fundamentally believe just as oxygen is to fire, so are unemployed youth to insecurity. And we have a tremendous number of unemployed youth in this country. Youth like Sandra, who on a Saturday morning in March 2014 woke up excited about the prospects of getting a coveted job at the Nigerian Immigration Service. She kissed her daughter goodbye, left her home, never to return. Because that day, Sandra and 15 other young Nigerians died applying for a job. In Nigeria, in the last 20 years, roughly 20 million youth have entered an oversaturated workforce, triggering not 1, not 2, but 3 insurgencies. With a median age of 18, in the next 20 years, 4 times the number, 80 million people will be entering that same oversaturated workforce. So my friends, if 20 million triggered Niger Delta crisis, Boko Haram, Jos crisis, I ask you, what will 4 times that number do? Many people who hear this statistic say, wow, this is a ticking time bomb. I think not. The bomb has actually exploded. Now, to do my part to solve this challenge, in 2012, I moved to a tiny little village that I'm sure none of you have ever heard of in the north. And I lived in a little one room and basically had an idea about how we could address this challenge. And the idea was to unlock the power of agriculture as a job creation engine and attract millions of young people into the sector. We knew this had been done before in countries like Thailand. Many of you might not recognize this, but Thailand, if you literally draw a line around the globe, Nigeria is about 4 degrees north on the equator to 14 degrees north on the equator. If you follow those lines of latitude around the world, Thailand is literally right exactly in that same line of latitude, which means fundamentally we get similar rainfall patterns, similar temperatures, so on and so forth. And for the most part, discounting for elevation, we can grow pretty much similar things. Now, in the 80s, Thailand was very similar to Nigeria. Very similar. Per capita GDP, pretty much exactly the same. Today, per capita GDP in Thailand is 4 times Nigeria. And why? How were they able to do that? Well, in the 80s, Thailand focused on making their small-scale farmers profitable and making agriculture a viable opportunity. By building on that strength of enabling agriculture to be highly productive and profitable, they were able to move from just exporting products to leveraging that opportunity to start to invest in agro-processing. Leveraging on that strength, they started to backward integrate into more complex forms of manufacturing, and today Thailand produces over 2 million cars more than the United Kingdom. And if you had to hazard a guess what their unemployment rate was, anybody? Anybody? Unemployment rate in Thailand today. Sorry? 10%? 10% over there. Anybody over here? 7% over there? 2% over there? 3%? Today, it is less than 1%. Less than 1%. Now, we recognize that to make this dream a reality, we had to make agriculture attractive to young people. And for today's conversation, a young man in northern Nigeria, we'll call him Saminu, for today, made it very clear to me that this would not be an easy proposition. Saminu grew up in a beautiful village in northern Nigeria, with rock formations dotting the countryside, absolutely gorgeous. But he knew as soon as he could, he would leave. Because as he said, growing up, we had babu, nothing. So the first chance Saminu got, he left his village, went to Kaduna City, borrowed a tattered motorcycle from his uncle. Now, when I say tattered, I mean, you know those motorcycles where the tires are more patches than tires? And he started to become an Okada driver. And he lived, every day in constant fear that his precious tattered motorcycle would be ripped away from him like it had in the past. Thankfully, when it did happen, he was lucky and he was able to get it back. But he knew other young men who were not so lucky. Other young men that once they lost their single source of livelihood, became destitute, recruited into Boko Haram, and became getaway drivers in bombings and kidnappings. Thankfully, on a fateful day, Saminu's father called him up and told him about this organization called Babangona, and told him that, look, now he has an opportunity to actually make a real living as a farmer. Trusting his father implicitly, he returned his tattered old motorcycle, rushed home, joined. Fast forward 2 years, he's earned enough money to own his own retail shop. He's earned enough money to buy not one, not two, but 3 goats for his mother to start a goat rearing business, and now owns 2 motorcycles with a license plate Babanguna. So now, what does it take to make these types of things come to life? Well, I think fundamentally, the challenge we face in Nigerian agriculture is very low levels of productivity. If you look at our farm level productivity across the board, it is often 20% of other developing countries. Not developed, developing countries. Talking about Southeast Asia, talking about Latin America. We are only, for every 5 bags of maize or 5 everything, right? We are able to accomplish 1. So how can we compete? Now, what does it take to improve that farm level productivity? Well, for us, we recognize it takes 4 key things. And that's where we support the tens of thousands of Babangona members today. The first is about training and ensuring that you're able to impart best practices in a very effective and efficient way to ensure that they are able to understand and adopt. The second is credit. Farming is a very, very working capital intensive business. And you have to be able to access credit to be able to buy the quantity and quality of inputs to become highly efficient and effective. The third is access to quality inputs. So to be able to ensure that you are able to work with the right suppliers, to streamline the supply chains and get those products efficiently and effectively to them. And then the third piece is around ensuring they're able to market your products and optimize your returns. So that's fundamentally how we've been able to enable tens of thousands of Zaminus. Now, as we look to the future, though, the reality is that we have so many more that are coming into the workforce. In Africa alone, in the next 20 years, 400 million people are entering an oversaturated workforce, 80 million of which are here in Nigeria. So as you look at your investments in agriculture, it's important that you think about how can you structure your business in such a way that will provide these types of opportunities. What are some options? Well, imagine you're in the business of providing inputs to farmers, selling fertilizers, chemicals, seeds, so on and so forth. Structure your business in such a way where you can provide your products on credit. It is possible to work with grassroots organizations to enable you to mitigate that risk. Today, we lend to thousands of farmers. Does anybody want to guess what our repayment rate is? Any guesses? Pretty close, 99.9. All right? So those risks exist, but they can be mitigated. If you're a business that is, say, in processing, and you want to purchase from farmers, think about how you can basically provide forward contracts to those farmers. The beauty of providing a forward contract is now that farmer is able to take that forward contract and go and raise capital so that they can farm and improve their productivity. Because fundamentally, as they improve their productivity, how does it benefit you as a processor? Over time, you will see a steady decline in the commodity prices for your products you buy, and you'll see a steady increase in the quality of the products that you buy. So, we fundamentally believe that we can envision a day when millions of young men and young women across Nigeria are able to have a viable livelihood through the power of agriculture. But it really does take a concerted effort from everyone. Now, I'm going to transition now to the second part of the discussion, where we'll pick some key important value chains and talk about the opportunities and some of the challenges that may exist. So I'll start with the livestock value chain. We'll focus on poultry and aquaculture. Then I'll move to the crop value chains, specific focus on maize, on rice, on cassava, and oil palm. And then if there's a particular commodity that you have a particular interest in, and I've not mentioned in the Q&A session, happy to take questions on that. So let's talk about livestock broadly. The number one driver of an agriculture sector in any country is the emerging eating habits of the middle class, right? And because basically that's the biggest group of people that start spending a little bit more on food. So if you want to ask yourself, what is it that the middle class is going to eat tomorrow? You have to answer one question. What do people eat at parties? Because what people eat at parties today is what they want to eat every day tomorrow. And so what do people eat at parties today? Sorry, chicken and rice. Okay? So it's because you see this dramatic growth in consumption Take China. In 1967, China had a per capita consumption of meat of around 7 kilograms per person. Today, that number is north of 52 kilograms per person. In Hong Kong, it's around 96 kilograms per person. In the US, it's about 120 kilograms per person per year. In Nigeria today, we're lucky if it's 9. And then on top of that, the reason why I'm particularly excited about the poultry sector is you've got another factor that's happening in the poultry sector in Nigeria, which is something I call share of stomach. If you look at chicken as a percentage of the share of stomach in Nigeria today, it's actually very low. If you look at similar countries with similar demographics, and you look at percentage of chicken consumption, it's dramatically different. Today in Nigeria, it's sub 25% percentage of meat consumed, of the meat that you consume in this country. Let's look at, the country that I often like to compare Nigeria to is Trinidad and Tobago, right? It's a relatively affluent country, predominantly people of African descent. Someone wants to guess what percentage share of stomach chicken is in Trinidad and Tobago? Sorry? 30%? Anybody else? 75? It's 85%. 85% of all meat consumed by people in Trinidad and Tobago is chicken. Right? Because fundamentally, what you're going to see is as the sector develops and gets more efficient, chicken actually becomes much cheaper. And because the fundamentals of chicken are that it's actually a pretty efficient way of producing meat. So that means you've got that opportunity around a dramatic growth in the sector, driven by emerging eating habits of the middle class, coupled by an accelerant to that growth by increase in share of stomach. Now there are some fundamental challenges with the poultry sector in Nigeria. The first and foremost is, despite the fact that it is banned, importation of poultry is banned, and for quite good reasons, because there's a lot of stories around how imported chicken has had a significant detrimental impact on people's health. There's you've got a significant amount of smuggling that still occurs that impacts the pricing in Nigeria. Because fundamentally, what is imported into Nigeria is all the stuff that the rest of the world doesn't want, right? In Brazil and so on and so forth, they produce chicken and they export it to the US and Europe. In the US and Europe, they like white meat. They want the breast, so on and so forth. They don't really like the dark meat, the thighs, the legs, so on and so forth. That's why if you look at, you can go and get imported chicken in Nigeria, all the laps and legs you want, because it's, for all intents and purposes, very limited value for them, because they make their money exporting the white meat. So there are some fundamental challenges to the sector that need to be addressed, and a constant effort to be made to help to protect the industry, to enable it to increase productivity. Then some other aspects are the fact that in the poultry space, you need to pay close attention to details, right? Because it is one of the higher value parts of the agricultural value chain, but also there are a lot of risks there, ensuring that you're able to do the right thing to control reduce the mortality and improve the productivity of your poultry. One of the critical things that actually impacts the productivity of the poultry space is there's a particular fungus that is found in a lot of the maize in Nigeria called aflatoxin. And there are ways for controlling for that fungus to ensure that it's safe. But if you're not controlling for that fungus, it can dramatically reduce the impact the immune system of your birds, and is one of the reasons why a poultry farmer can wake up one morning and half his chickens are dead because they had feed that had a high amount of aflatoxin, suppressed their immune system, they caught something, and it wiped them all out. So ensuring that you are sourcing your feed and your maize and your groundnut cake and so on and so forth very consciously to ensure that you are controlling for this aflatoxin is going to be critical to your success then. Moving on to aquaculture. Aquaculture, once again, similar to poultry, has a lot of the similar dynamics as the poultry space. I think the critical challenge, so it's going to benefit from a similar rise in increased meat consumption. Now, on the aquaculture side, the major challenge that one faces is if you look at the types of fish that we usually consume in Nigeria, their requirement in their feed for animal protein that is particularly high. And so that animal protein typically comes from fish meal. And the reality, as a country, we do not have a strong fish meal industry. And so until that happens, the reality is our fish meal is going to be imported, our feed is going to be imported, and it's going to make productivity in that space a challenge. But at the same time, it's an incredible opportunity for an entrepreneur in this room that says, look, let me see how I can be the first person to create a real fish meal industry in Nigeria that will enable the industry to take off. Because once you solve that constraint, I believe that industry is going to explode. So that's on the livestock side. So let's talk about the crop side. And I'll start with the one crop I was talking about that we eat at parties, which is rice. Now, today Nigeria consumes in the range of about 5 to 6 million tons of rice, half of which is imported. Now, projections show that by 2036, Nigeria will be consuming somewhere in the range of about 30 million tons of rice, 5 times what we are consuming today. Now, the world's rice is a massive industry globally. About 600 million tons of rice in the world is produced and consumed. But most of it is produced and consumed in the same place. So the actual traded volumes of rice in the world are actually quite small, estimated somewhere between 30 and 40 million. If you look at the world's largest exporter of rice, Thailand alone only exports about 10 million tons of rice. So I ask you, if Nigeria is consuming 6 today, of which 3 is imported, and we need to consume 30, where is it going to come from? And as I started the talk, if you draw a line around the world, Thailand and Nigeria, very similar. So it means that rice can do very well here. Now, what would it take to truly unlock Nigeria's potential on the rice side? The reality is it's going to take a significant, and if you want to truly optimize production, the reality is, places like Thailand and other parts of the world have been producing rice for generations, and they've been able to have very flat pieces of land that are able to manage water very effectively. And the second piece is around irrigation. The reality is, pretty much most places in the world, the government has invested in irrigation because it's a tough business to invest in and make money. So for rice to truly be unlocked, you really need to get those 2 key pieces solved. But there are places in Nigeria today where those challenges are already being solved, and you're seeing dramatic increase in productivity. Now, let's talk about cassava. Cassava is often a crop that a lot of people talk about a lot, and it's because we are the world's biggest producer of cassava, producing anywhere between 30 and 40 million metric tons per year. That's a lot of cassava. Now, cassava has a lot of opportunity because there's a lot of derivatives from it, starch, sugar. It can be used for animal feed, and if you make it into chips and then into fuel for ethanol, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of derivatives that can be produced from cassava, which make it quite interesting. Now, the reality now is, on the cassava side, the challenge one faces is similar to many of the other crops around productivity. Today, average yields for cassava are between 10 and 15 metric tons per hectare. In Thailand, they're around 24 metric tons per hectare. So we have this significant productivity gap that makes it a challenge. And on the cassava side, it really stems mostly from having access to the right, what they call stems, to ensure. So now the good news is that there are a lot of organizations out there that are trying to work to develop stem, high-quality stem production systems, so you can get access to the right genetic material to optimize your productivity on the cassava side. Now, if you're looking at cassava on the on the processing side, one of the critical challenges you face with cassava is that it's very perishable. So it comes out of the ground, and literally you've got about 72 hours before quality starts to degrade. So you factor in perishability, poor rural road networks, and you recognize that your caption area that you can realistically pull in from is going to be relatively small. So it means if you're going to be a successful investor or entrepreneur in the cassava processing space, you need to invest heavily in ensuring that you are building up an effective network around you, which is not a trivial exercise, but can be done. Now, the other crop that we'll talk about today is oil palm. So, oil palm, as many of you probably have heard the story, oil palm is indigenous to West Africa and particularly to Nigeria, and the Malaysians came to Nigeria and collected the oil palm and planted it there, and now are much more successful. That's only half of the story. The reality is that that was actually not the thing that made them successful. Because they did that, and their oil palms in Malaysia were actually underperforming. Productivity was way worse than West Africa. So they spent years trying to figure out why, and on one of their visits, they realized there was this particular insect that was indigenous here that was actually pollinating the plants that they didn't have in Malaysia. So they went and packaged up a bunch of those insects and took them over to Malaysia, and productivity went through the roof. So today in Malaysia, they're getting 22 tons of what's called FFB, fresh fruit bunch. So that's bunch, juice of oil palm. Anybody know what the average in Nigeria is? 3. So they're getting 22, we're getting 3. The reality is they have about 3 million hectares of oil palm. 3 million hectares. Nigeria also has 3 million hectares of oil palm. They're getting 22, we're getting 3. So that's why today, two of the biggest, one of the largest private companies on this planet produces oil palm out of Malaysia. The number 2 company is an $18 billion a year company in revenues. So what do we need to do, right? So the reality is, to make oil palm work, you need in Nigeria, you're going to need patient capital. Because what is required is a very deliberate effort to basically take all those trees on 3 million hectares that are producing 3 tons per hectare, The variety is called Dura. And replace all of them with varieties that can get you 16, 18, if you're lucky, 20. There are still some fundamental benefits that Malaysia has over Nigeria with regards to oil palm production, which could still be solved. Fundamentally, one of the key benefits they have is their rains tend to come early in the morning, and they get sunshine throughout the rest of the day. For us, rains come throughout the day, so that limits solar radiation and limits the potential. But the reality is, with good breeding, and there may be opportunities to overcome some of those challenges potentially. So, so that's kind of just gives you those crops. Now, one thing I'll leave with, particularly on maize. Today in Nigeria, when people think about maize, the first thing that comes, when I tell everybody, we produce a lot of maize, right? The first thing that comes to people's mind is, how do you roast and chew that? And I'm like, yes, you can roast and chew maize. That's one use of maize. But maize is unique of all the crops in the world. There's no crop that puts on, maybe, it competes a little bit with sugarcane, but there's no crop that will, in a short period of time, put on as much what's called biomass. So grow as much mass efficiently than maize. So what that means is there's a lot of maize out there. And what people have done is, in the rest of the world, there are 27,000 different uses for maize. 27,000 different uses for maize. And in Nigeria, we chew it and we feed it to chickens. So we've got two. So there's 26,998. Few more left uses. So as you're thinking about investing in the agricultural value chain more on the processing side, I encourage many of you to think about opportunities around leveraging the fact that Nigeria produces about 12 million tons of maize. It's the fastest growing in terms of production of volumes. And Nigeria is projected to produce north of 20 million tons of maize by 2025. So at this juncture, I will pause for my moderator and see what questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kola. I think that was really insightful. Now, one of the things that struck me at the beginning was the emphasis you placed on agriculture just as a means of generating employment for the youth of this country. And I think that's such an important perspective to bring to agriculture. Now, we do have a few questions. I think our audience has been very impressed with the insights that you have shared. One of the questions is, are you available to mentor those who are considering venturing into agribusiness? Yeah. Free of charge, I hope. Then there are also people in the audience who are contemplating going into agriculture. And I know you've spoken about various crops and on the animal side as well. But what are the factors that you would say people must consider before deciding to throw their hats into the ring, as it were, in the agriculture space? And then there's a question of... yes. Okay. Okay.
So the first two factors to think about in getting into and on the mentoring side. So always happy to provide advice and coaching in any capacity I have. I will be happy to provide my email address to anyone who would like to follow up. Now, on the question around investing in the sector. So I think the reality is just like investing in anything, you have to start by thinking critically about what is your competitive advantage, right? The reality is I see a lot of folks that say, I want to become a farmer because my father has some land in Ijebu Ode. When he says some land, like 2 plots. And I want to keep my house in Lekki and go and visit the farm on the weekends. The reality is agriculture there's a lot of variables, right? And you have to get into the details. And there's probably no quicker way to lose money than to just outsource those details, particularly in the early days, right? It's imperative. You don't always have to do that, but you need to make sure in the early days you understand what you are doing, right? Before I decided to support thousands of smallholder farmers, I made sure I was a smallholder farmer. I went to Kanu, I got 1.5 hectares, and I farmed 1.5 hectares. So I understand the challenges of those individuals. I understand when a cow in the middle of your season will just enter your farm and decide to have lunch, right? You need to understand the details, right? The first year when we launched, 6 months, lived in the village, ate indomie and kilishi for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but needed to understand the business. There's not one job in my business that I have not done. Well, actually, there's one. I tried. The lifting a 100-kilo bag of maize, not an easy thing. So you need to make sure you're willing to invest that time and energy to truly understand. Now, going back to the discussion around competitive advantage. So I look at folks that want to actually go into crop farming. And I say, okay, so what's your competitive advantage? And I say, okay, who are the folks that are already in crop farming and what's their competitive advantage? So let's look at a small-scale farmer in Nigeria today. Well, number one, they have much cheaper access to labor than you, fundamentally. Number two, due to relationships and so on and so forth, they also have, they probably have much cheaper access to land than you. So why would you think that you would be able to outcompete them? And then the other factor is, if you look at land in Nigeria, so today Nigeria has about 84 million hectares of arable land. It sounds like a lot, right? How many people do we have? So basically, you've got about half a hectare per person in Nigeria, right? But if you actually now look at that on a per capita rural population and do the math, in 1960, Nigeria had about 2 hectares per capita of per capita rural population. The reality is land is not a finite thing, right? Land actually goes away due to urbanization, salinization, erosion, desertification. And so the amount of land is shrinking, and the people that need that land is growing. So you've actually seen that today, per capita amount of land per rural inhabitant is about 0.9 hectares per person. Fast forward to 2030, that's going to be 0.5 hectares per rural inhabitant. So folks that expect that they can go out and acquire massive tracts of land, they may be able to do it today, but the truth of the matter is in 2030, when there's a bunch of people around them that have no land, it's going to become a much more challenging enterprise. So, and for the folks in this room, the reality is that the agricultural value chain is very long. You can play on the input side, you can play on the processing side, you can play in the production side, and that's where you can actually leverage your competitive advantage, right? If you have that 1 plot, 2 plots of land in Ijebu Ode, you can invest, that is enough land for a processing facility, right? If you're blessed with incredible intelligence, right? You can invest on the input side, seed development, new chemicals, all kinds of things that could tailor products that could dramatically unlock the productivity of millions of farmers, right? It's like the guy that, the old adage that said, you know, the folks that went for the California gold rush, right? Do you know who made the most money of the people who rushed to San Francisco for the California gold rush? It was the guys that sold the picks to the guys who were trying to find gold, right? So I think it's about thinking about what your competitive advantage is and how you can unlock that. And don't always just think about agriculture is I must have a farm.
Kola, there's another set of questions that are focused on specific sectors. So there are questions regarding whether you can provide insights on snail farming, piggery, cultivation of vegetables, and sesame seeds. So do you have a perspective on any of those sectors?
Sure. Snail farming, great margins, right? It's a great margin business. The key thing there is around, I've yet to see someone that's been able to truly scale it, right? So, that's one. So, and I think the reality is those types of niche plays in the livestock sector, I think go once again in line with all the other pieces that we talked about. The critical thing, as I mentioned there, is around figuring out how to scale that. And I think one of the critical pieces on figuring out how to scale that is basically around ensuring that you can standardize the input side of it and turn it into something what you're seeing now in aquaculture and so on and so forth. Once again, the truth of the matter is the opportunity might lie in actually be the guy that can figure that out and enable that whole industry to scale. The other ones were
piggery, cultivation of vegetables, and then sesame seeds.
So poultry, there's been a dramatic growth in piggeries in Nigeria. It's interesting. Exactly. So it's really, I think. Once again, I think the opportunity there on the piggery side it's one of the more early stage industries, and particularly on the livestock side, when you start, there's a lot of investment that needs to happen on the types of breeds and ensuring you get the right breeds and so on and so forth. Because the truth of the matter is yes, it's growing, but if you look at the productivity, you know, the average pig I see on a Nigerian pig farm compared to the average pig I see somewhere else is like a sumo wrestler compared to Lekba, right? So it's really so I think once again, the people that have done well, I think, in this space are the folks that have taken the time and energy to go and identify breeds that are rugged enough in this market and have the attributes that they're looking for. So, for example, we now have bacon that is being produced to reasonable quality compared to bacon outside the country, which is driven by the fact that people have invested in getting the right breeds that can do that. Are we there yet? Not 100%. Vegetable farming. Vegetable farming, once again, these are very high value margin places. And the truth of it is, usually what you see when you see that things that are high margin is you're also seeing that it means it's also very complex and tends to have high risks. two things that inhibit scale. Because the truth of the matter is that even when I talk about high margin in the agriculture space, agriculture as a industry, because it's food, tends to be relatively lower margin. So the reality is you always want to think about businesses that can get you to scale. Because if you can't get to scale, it's not going to keep you engaged, and you'll continue to do it part-time. And because then you hit this downward spiral, because I'm doing part-time, let me get my cousins, friends, sister to go and watch the vegetable farm, and I'll come and visit them on weekends, and then you really start going into that downward spiral. On the sesame side, sesame is an opportunity, particularly we've seen dramatic growth in the export markets for sesame in Nigeria, dramatic growth over the last half decade. But to be frank, once again, similar to many other sectors, it's not as formalized. Most of the people are just trading in it, and I think there's still significant opportunities to help drive up productivity there.
Okay. There's keen interest in what you're doing in Babangona. Oh, sorry? Babangona, yes, keen interest in that. There are questions around, are there opportunities for replicating this in other parts of the country? There's also a question asking, is there an investment opportunity in Babangona, and what is the return on investment?
So I'll take the first part. So I think definitely as we look to, we firmly believe there is opportunity to replicate what we've done in other parts of the country, in other value chains. And once again, happy to engage with folks on that. On the investment side, we do actually raise a significant amount of capital. We mostly debt. We launched Nigeria's first impact bond a few years ago. We've got quite a few investors that are investing in that impact bond. And once again, if there are folks that are interested in that, happy to chat on that. And
no, I think that was it, really, about replicating it. Mm-hmm. Then there are questions that look at the future. Mm-hmm. So these questions ask, what do you think is the future of soil-less farming in Nigeria? How do you see the impact of climate change? And then what impact is biotechnology, genetic engineering, going to have on food production in Nigeria? So soil-less farming, biotechnology, and climate change.
So soil-less farming, so there's really two reasons why people do soil-less farming. One is they have no soil, so they're in the middle of the city. And two is there's something wrong with the soil that they have. And so, particularly for vegetable farmers in the Southwest, unfortunately, we do have particular challenges with our soil in the Southwest that make it very difficult to do vegetable farming. It's a fundamental reason why most all the tomatoes in Nigeria come from the north. And so, for that piece, once again, it really comes down to if you want to think about growing a scalable business, right? If you're growing a scalable business where your cost of production is so much higher because you have to import this soil, and you're competing with somebody who has a very low cost of production, the reality is that, yes, you might be able to make money on a few periods of time when there's a supply shock or so on and so forth, but is it truly going to be a scalable solution, a scalable business? And then with regards to the people who want to farm in places where there is no land, I've seen it done. It's in places like Singapore, where Singapore is the size of Ikoyi, VI, and parts of Lekki. So but once again, it's I don't think that's something that's particularly relevant in our market.
Right. Genetic engineering.
So biotech. So biotech has received a lot of negative press over the years, and the reality is the folks that were the most negative on biotech have actually started to accept it. right? So the European Union has been one of the most vocal opponents to biotechnology. And there's multiple reasons. People think potentially that's because they really care about not having biotechnology. Others think that potentially it was their way of trying to ensure that they could block imports from the US and protect their markets, as well as protect the markets that they trade to, which is mostly their old colonies in Africa and other places. So they've pushed a lot of the ideas around biotech and issues with biotech. The truth of the matter is that biotech is like many other technologies. When they first come out, people are scared of new things, right? And I think it's important that we don't just go out and embrace everything new right away, but we give it an opportunity to prove whether it's good or not. Biotech has been used going on 20 years today. And study after study after study by the European Union and all other types of organizations have not shown any negative side effects to biotechnology. None. And that is why the European Union has started, certain countries have started to allow biotechnology into their markets, and they're changing. And the reality is, as Nigerians, the truth of the matter is, if you eat, how many people eat cornflakes? Right? If you eat imported cornflakes, you've been eating biotech for your whole life, right? And you don't have 3 eyes yet, do you? Right? So I think it does the Nigerian farmer a disservice when they are trying to compete with the rest of the world and they are blocked from having access to the tools to compete. So I think the reality is, I think there's an opportunity there for Nigeria to explore some of these technologies on a case-by-case basis. And let me tell you a very practical example. Nigeria blocks all biotech today. Okay? In 1960, Nigeria was West Africa's largest producer of cotton. The first biotech product to be adopted globally was biotech cotton, BT cotton, because people don't eat, generally, most people don't eat their clothes. But Nigeria still does not allow for BT cotton. So guess what? Guess who's the biggest producer of cotton in West Africa today? It's countries like Burkina Faso and so on and so forth, right? Benin Republic is even potentially doing more cotton than us, right? So it's these types of decisions that, once again, makes it impossible. The Nigerian farmer is already suffering from so many issues that now you're making it practically impossible for them to compete.
There's a set of questions that focus on the issue of financing. Mm-hmm. And fundamentally, it's about how do you access credit to finance agriculture in Nigeria?
So there's a lot of focus on trying to raise capital. But I think the reality is, too often I see entrepreneurs that focus too early on trying to raise debt. You need to build up a track record before people will be willing to invest debt in you. Yeah. And so you need to be willing to seed. If you don't have the capital yourself, you have to be willing to cede some control of your business to people that can give you that capital in the early days. Because you have to build up a track record before people will take you seriously. And the other reality is, the Nigerian banking sector kind of goes through quite a few cycles. I remember when we started, it was relatively easy to get debt. Today, if you want to try and raise debt, you have to bring your house, your car, your child, everything, right? And so you need to be able to ensure that that you build up equity in your business. And to do that, if you don't have the capital, you have to find people that would be willing to back you, and you have to make a compelling opportunity for them by ceding some control in your business. It's a challenge we face in Nigeria, but we're not going to seriously grow until we change the mindset that I must own everything, right? There are ways to have control in your business without owning everything. And if you look at the SME space in countries like India and so on and so forth, they had that same challenge to us. But the sector is probably about 10 years ago, people started understanding the concept of let me bring equity investors into my business and structure it properly so I can have some level of control, but I'm still giving some of my business economic opportunity away, and then start to grow. Because relying on debt, and also relying heavily on special government programs that may be there today, may not be there tomorrow. I have customers who practically went bankrupt overnight because they were relying on some program that as soon as it went away, all the capital left their business. So it's not saying that you shouldn't explore those programs, but don't rely on those programs.
Now, there's some people are looking at further down in the value chain, so other than the crops and the livestock. So there's a set of questions asking that when you look at the value chain, which aspect of it would you say has the highest margin?
So margin goes, it's very simple. Margin goes with complexity and risk.
Yeah.
It's very simple, right? With the complexity and risk, there are less people doing it. You can chop more margin, right? Now, there's a slight caveat in the agriculture sector. Because we're dealing with underlying commodities, that the price of those commodities vary with supply and demand. What you do also tend to see is are these cycles where you'll have a scenario where everybody will start farming a particular commodity, right? So supply will go up, and then eventually prices will crash, and everybody will stop farming that commodity. And the few guys that hang around, eventually, supply goes down, and then prices go up. So you go through this oscillation. So generally what you find in the agriculture space is that from production to processing, margins tend to shift as those supply and demand dynamics shift of the underlying commodity that you're processing.
I see. Okay.
Which means that you have to prepare for that, right? Yeah. Because you will have a business that in 1 year you will be making a ton of money, and the next year you'll be breaking even, right? Right. So you basically have to ensure that you build up a cash buffer to ensure that you can ride out those commodity cycles.
Right. I think this next question speaks directly to what you're saying, because it's asking how long does it take really to achieve break-even? How long does it take before you start making real money in agriculture? So as an investor, if I'm thinking of going into it, what sort of time horizon should I be looking at before I start printing money?
So it's going to be an overly generalized answer, because I think people have recognized when we talk about agriculture, it's like talking about services, right? Which covers everything from the guy that sells you your scratch card to a bank, right? So it's such a broad sector. So the reality is, from what generally I've seen, you're going to need to probably, as an entrepreneur, be able to burn cash for at least 5 to 10 years before you probably start looking at returns, right? Because the reality, in those early years, you're actually investing, because at the end of the day, it's about getting to scale. So you're going to have to be investing in things to get you to scale. And if you don't make those investments, you will not scale. And if you don't scale, you're going to go along at this small rate, because I think at the end of the day, with ag, as I mentioned, because of the nature of the margins, it's a scale business.
Right. Okay. The last set of questions, I mean, there are two more sectors people are asking about. One of them is groundnuts, and the other one is, could you say a bit more about animal feeds? So groundnuts and animal feeds, and then we'll take a final question. Yeah.
Okay. So 1960, Nigeria was 42% market share in the world trade of groundnuts. Within 7, 8 years, we were practically zero. Now, a couple things happened. One was, people recognized that there was a food toxin, the toxin I talked about earlier, aflatoxins, that are predominant. It's even worse, much worse in peanuts. And so that caused the peanut market to completely shift. Now, the other thing is reality is the peanut market globally has struggled significantly because as the market has shifted away from peanut oil to vegetable oils from oil palm and so on and so forth. So today, the biggest opportunity in the groundnut space is what's called confectionaries, which is basically all your peanuts that are in Snickers bars and baked products and so on and so forth. Now, the types of peanuts that those industries require are slightly different from the traditional varieties that we use. Traditional varieties that we use were were originally popularized because of their potential for peanut oil. So if you're looking at the peanut space, you're going to need to find a good research institute, find the right confectionery peanuts, and that are adapted to wherever you want to produce, and make that necessary investment.
Right. Okay. The last question I have here says, you've used a lot of good statistics and data during the course of your presentation. Where does one get access to the data, the insights, the research that one needs when one is trying to enter into this sector?
Sorry, actually, I realized I didn't touch on the animal feed piece.
The animal feed, yes.
So I think, yes, on the animal feed side, I think I've touched, I think, as I mentioned, one of the most critical things to think about on the animal feed side is around, similar to my discussion around fish meal, right? I said the aquaculture space is going to struggle as long as we have to continue to import fish meal, right? Because just that act of importing and the costs associated with that and so on and so forth are going to make it less productive versus other places. So what made Thailand become Thailand is they became first self-sufficient in products and were able to build on that on being competitive in those raw materials to now start to invest in higher value aspects of the value chain. The same thing applies with animal feed. Today, I think we do have vast majority of animal feed in Nigeria uses local production, but there is a disturbing trend towards using imported products for animal feed, imported soybean, imported maize, other products, so on and so forth. So once again, I ask the question, if we don't invest in ensuring that we develop productive markets for these products that can be produced here and take short-term pain for long-term gain, the sector will never be able to outcompete imported poultry. You'll be banning and smuggled poultry for the rest. Our great-grandchildren will be banning imported poultry, right? Unless we take the necessary steps to invest in domestic supply chains to produce those products and ensure that we can do it competitively. It's very short-term thinking to think about looking at imports of things that can be produced here productively. And that's one of the biggest challenges I see today with the livestock sector.
Right. Yes, the last question was on the data in terms of where do you get all the data?
So the reality is, Nigeria is, it's not I've been doing this for a little while.
Okay.
And it's from having many, 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 many conversations with people, reading a tremendous amount, there's very, if you go, the best repository I've seen of some data is what's called FAO Stats. It's a food and agriculture organization. If you go to their website, they've got something called FAO Stats. It's very nicely organized, and they do have a fair amount of good data there. But there's also the need to go out and have a lot of conversations with people and build up your own data sets.
Okay, Kola, thank you very much for all the insights you've shared. It's been really tremendous. Now, so as we sit back and reflect on the things that Kola has shared with us, the perspective that I've received here, several messages. One, agriculture is so fundamental to the generation of employment and keeping our youth occupied. But the other thing for me is the realization that, yes, we can go into agriculture and there are huge opportunities, several avenues for doing so. But the game in agriculture over time is to develop scale. And to develop scale is going to require investment. It's also going to require a lot of patience and perseverance, because there are challenges. Kola spoke about it, 5 to 10 year time frame in which you would keep investing until you now start printing money. So this is a business and a sector with huge opportunities. We can all rush in and do our thing on a smaller scale. If we want to make a real impact, we've got to approach this just like any other business. You've got to do your research. You've got to talk to the technical experts. You've got to run the numbers, look at the financing, make sure it all makes sense, and really be professional in the approach to it. With all of that, I think then you will make a real impact in the agricultural space. But the beauty of this space is you can either decide I'm going in for the big impact, or I'm going in, just on a small scale. But thank you very much for those insights.
Well, thank you very much. And I will take this opportunity to just shamelessly plug the fact that if anybody is looking to learn about the agriculture sector, we are always looking for good talent. So feel free to visit us at babangona.com. And we're constantly looking for folks who want to change the world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kola, on behalf of all of us here at the King's Court, we have a small gift to present to you. Thank you very much. We will be sharing Kola's contact details since he has so generously offered to mentor all of us. The next session starts in about 15 minutes' time. There are 3 sessions coming up. The session on fintech and digital financial services, that will be on the ground floor. There's a session on SMEs and entrepreneurship, which will be on the 3rd floor. And then there's a session on privatization, which will be on the 5th floor. So please, depending on which session you want to attend, you go to the appropriate venue. Fintech, ground floor, SMEs, entrepreneurship, 3rd floor, privatization on the 5th floor. And those sessions will be starting in about 15 minutes from now. Thank you very much.